Well, hello people. Welcome back to World of Tanks with CS once again. I guess this episode is mostly focused on gameplay involving some of the most popular Soviet tanks we have in the game. They're arguably staples in many people's garages, and they've been around for a long time. Obviously, they have undergone some pretty major changes over the years, including both buffs and nerfs, HD models, and so on and so forth. But perhaps, another interesting thing to note about this replay or this video is the fact that instead of, the games being conventionally reasonably well played, they are more, quote, interesting instead. Sit tight and let's just see what unfolds. So, in the first game, I'm in my Tier 9 Soviet heavy tank, the T-10, formerly the IS-3, which got a pretty major armor buff after the HD model hit. I believe the turret, it's significantly stronger than the way it was before. And we are having a Tier 10 game, unfortunately for me. So, I guess, this is the thing about the T-10, in the sense that, it's one of those heavy tanks that have almost the mobility of a medium tank, but it also has the firepower of a heavy tank, and I guess the armor of a relatively raw armor medium tank, but which is only mediocre for a heavy tank, if you know what I mean. The turret for the T-10 is as good as any high-tier Russian tank you run into the game, give or take. It will not be out of place as a tank for, or should I say as a turret for a Tier 10 medium, or even a Tier 10 heavy. The entire turret is essentially immune to any gun with less than 270mm penetration. Not counting for, lucky shots or crazy RNG, if you will. The hull, meanwhile, is resistant to give or take about a 200mm gun. Maybe a little less if, if you manage to negate the angle by positioning yourself well, such as, shooting at the cheeks when you're sideways onto the T-10, or going for the lower plate. But I guess, it still offers reasonable protection for a Tier 9, even though, the same level of protection for a Tier 8 would have been good instead. And of course, and unfortunately, the T-10 is not really one of those Tier 9 heavy tanks that's known for their armor, like the E-75 or the STI. But, a lot of people go as far as to argue how the T-10 is a misfit, it's a freak show, how if you want to drive a tank like this, you're better off with the medium, but in a sense I disagree. Because the T-10 does have a bigger health pool, overall the T-10 is still more durable than most mediums, and the T-10 does have a heavy gun, which means, it shoots AP, it has 258mm penetration, which is good, and of course AP normalizes well, so that's definitely a big advantage versus tanks that shoot heat or APCR. As you know, the other two ammo types get no normalization or only a lesser amount of normalization, if you will. And unfortunately, in this game, my tank is not really well armored enough to be a frontline pusher. As you know, there are many enemy tanks, Tier 10s in question where I play. I would not want to essentially, consume my HP pool as quote armor, if you will. So essentially I'm playing the tank like a bit of a medium in the sense that I'm flanking the enemy and I'm shooting at the vulnerable flanks where the armor is thinner. But then, as you can see right there, I took a shot at the fairly flat front of a Japanese heavy tank. You will not go through because, you know, obviously the guy has 250mm plus at some angle. So, you know, it's just something that's unlikely to happen. But then, you know, the enemy return fire mostly hit my turret, and the armor blocked enemy shots from penetrating. I guess, you know, sometimes when you're playing this tank, you have to think like, you know, you are playing a medium. You have to know, you know, when and how to remove yourself from any given situation. You have to know that, you know, insistence on staying in one spot is not really, you know, it's not really something that's, you know, productive, if you will, or prudent. And there's nothing covered about being able to run away when it's time to run away. You know, perhaps, you know, pointless and senseless sacrifice is not really good sacrifice, if you will. One good thing about the T-10 is that, you know, even though it's not low profile like a T-54, it is relatively compact for a heavy tank. That means, you know, you can essentially take advantage of debris and racks and terrain features and things in the city as hard cover for your own protection. This, in a sense, is something that, you know, would be trickier to achieve had you been running something like a EVA 100 or a Mouse, just simply because they're so tall that, you know,
enemy vehicle destroyed.
Even if and when you find cover, they're usually not sufficient to protect yourself, just simply because your own tank is so big.
We didn't even scratch them.
And now here's a really tricky situation. The enemy Japanese heavy tank managed to cliff dive and then ended up landing on its side. But then unfortunately, he still managed to have his gun pointed at me even when he's sideways on. So what I did was I baited him into shooting, and then I rushed him while he's reloading. And then I auto-aimed and simply penetrated his relatively thin top armor. Like the way I guess ground attack aircrafts were able to do in the war. As you know, it's impossible to make the tank well armored up top without making the tank too heavy, give or take. So, you know, in a real warfare or just a combat situation, usually 20 or 30mm autocannons will do. It is what it is. Okay, so here's our second replay. I mean my IS-3 Tier 8 Russian heavy tank, which had been featured on the channel before. But I believe, you know, this might be the first Ace Tanker replay I showcase on this tank. So let's sit back and see what happens. So we are playing on Secret Valley, which is the Korean map or / Asian map. And obviously the spot on the map where usually all the heavy brawlers goes to are on the north side. And of course I have no reservation of, you know, going there, simply because, you know, matchmaking is relatively favorable. You know, of course, you know, if I was going to this corner in IS-3, but the matchmaker put me in a Tier 10 match, it would have been virtual suicide, essentially. And the good thing about IS-3 is that, you know, it's got a good gun with decent alpha penetration. Of course, the view range of the tank is kind of poor, and the DPM is not great. but you also happen to have fairly decent mobility for what it is, a bona fide heavy tank. Another thing to know about this gun is that, aside from the relatively mediocre DPM or reload, it handles fairly well for a Russian gun. Even though its hard stat accuracy, it's only so-so at, I believe, 0.4, the bloom, it's pretty good. So in other words, the tank will brawl very well and shoot very well when you're in a mid-range engagement. And of course, some players will go as far as to argue that, because the tank is Russian, it must have pretty good RNG. I guess sometimes, that feels kind of true.
Enemy is hit.
One thing to note is, even though at a certain point of
Enemy armor is destroyed.
World Tanks life cycle, if you will, the IS-3 was known to be a very well armored tank, which is still kind of true in the sense that, the turret of the IS-3 is reliable against, even 250mm penetrating guns. If they miss your weak spots, the whole of the IS-3 can be penetrated by well-aimed 175mm shots. For example, if the enemy's in a T-20 or M6 or IS or even KV-85, and they manage to negate the angle of your armor cheeks on the side of your pike, they can usually go through, unfortunately.
Enemy is hit.
But I will probably go as far as to argue that this gun at tier 8 feels like arguably the most satisfying heavy tank weapon there is for its tier. Just simply because the handling is good and the penetration and alpha are good. I mean, sure, the T-34 might have 10 more alpha, but its DPM is even lower and the handling is arguably worse. And the new German VK100 does have a 440 alpha weapon with about the same amount of penetration, but I guess perhaps the DPM feels worse and also the handling feels worse. And of course, the VK100, it's a much clumsier platform, being much heavier and taller and slower, both in a straight line and in a turn.
Enemy vehicle destroyed.
So in a sense, the VK is more like a damage sink and a positional defender, but the IS-3 can be forced into the role of a pseudo medium or a pusher heavy or a heavy flanker, just so that its own blend, its own balance of mobility, protection, and firepower works out favorably for what it is. But that's what wargaming does. You know how it is.
Enemy armor is damaged.
But when you are facing against essentially tier 6s, they essentially have no chance to do anything to you unless they hit your weak spot. But then the tank's agile enough and you can maneuver well enough that the enemies usually miss. And ultimately the tank lack a big weak spot like some of the German tanks have, such as the lower plate. I do believe the lower plate and the upper plate of the IS-3 are about the same thickness and have roughly the same degree of effectiveness. So that's that. I guess perhaps one more thing to note about IS-3 is the fact that its depression is not so great, but it's still serviceable at 5 degrees. So if you know your spots and you know where you're going, you know what you're doing, it's not a problem at all.
We didn't penetrate their armor.
Unfortunately, I do believe I managed to hit the enemy artillery on his gun, which means my shot bounces, even though you might have damaged his gun.
Penetration.
But then one time I was in my IS-7 and
Permission to engage.
I shot at a
Enemy vehicle destroyed.
fell tractor, or should I say loud tractor, and his tracks ate my shot. So that's wargaming for you, if you will. And so here's the third replay for today's video, also in my IS-3, and this is actually a replay that's much more recent than what we had before. I'm actually platooning with two of my platoon mates, Mutant and Wolf, I believe. A little hard to see here, but it is what it is. This unfortunately was a loss, but we showcase further about how the IS-3 should be played, and also its potential. So on this map, the new meta regarding heavies is for them to go on the peninsula on the eastern side of the map, as the western side of the map is arguably more vulnerable to artillery as well as camping tank destroyers than the eastern side of the map, even though to an extent the eastern side of the map is also vulnerable to camping tank destroyers and snipers. And I believe the correct meta for this position is to have friendly coverage on both sides of this obstacle course, and to provide suppression and overwatch fire to punish enemy for peeking. Meanwhile, putting your own friendly units in positions that's relatively invulnerable to enemy flanking and sniping fire.
Penetration.
And I do believe at this point, unfortunately, my friendly tanks are too far behind to really help me. But then, you know, since I had no choice, because if I fall back further, the covers available on the backside aren't as usable as these. But then, unfortunately, I'm essentially facing off against 3 separate enemies, and it's kind of difficult to angle your armor against all 3 of them, unfortunately. Arguably, even a mouse can do that. You can be vulnerable from several different angles, especially, you know, when you're faced off against enemies that are equipped with appropriate guns to deal with you. And unfortunately, the enemy is essentially beating me down with a 1-2 punch. The IS-6 has pretty solid alpha, and the Tiger has pretty good DPM, and good handling, good penetration. So they were, in a sense, picking me apart, and I simply didn't have the DPM to match. But thankfully, Mutant managed to show up in his Mutant, of all things, and back me up. And we managed to annihilate the enemies at that point.
Gotcha.
And you see, the good thing about IS-3 is that, you know, it has sufficient penetration for a tier 8 that in certain situations you simply do not have to only shoot enemies' weak spots anymore, such as, you know, what I did with the enemy KB5. Sure, you know, if you were tier 6 or tier 7 or some other tier 8, you might have to shoot his Radio Man's mini turret, but it was really a non-issue for me, as, you know, the front edge of his turret is actually fairly flat, and, you know, I simply had enough penetration to go right through anyways. And unfortunately, our friendly western flank is mostly falling apart. At that point, or should I say at this point, one option for us would be to go back and defend. Another option would be for us to push and win this flank and thus create an asymmetrical threat against the enemy's current deployment scheme and, should I say, accomplishments, if you will.
We didn't penetrate their armor. Enemy is hit.
And unfortunately, my first hit on the T-28 prototype managed to bounce off his relatively well-angled cupolas, which are not thin and also fairly well-angled.
Enemy vehicle destroyed.
But my second and third shot managed to penetrate his whole side and his turret cheeks. Always gotta process information about how thick the enemy's armor is and also how well angled every single patch of the armor are.
Got him.
At this point, our team very much had a chance to win, but you can argue, several miscalculations took place and things unfortunately didn't work out. The enemies know that, they are dealing with less versatile tanks that are smaller and lower on health and has work armor. So what they did was to try to overwhelm me from multiple angles and directions. You got an enemy light tank, which didn't really have enough penetration to get to me. You have the enemy SU-100M1, which unfortunately had a guns that can get through me, but lacks turrets, enough health, and armor to bounce my shots. So, a good rule of thumb at this point is to keep calm and not get distracted, not get flustered.
To engage. Enemy armor is damaged. Bail out. This vehicle has had it.
As you can see there, I managed to turn and angle my armor against one of the enemy's lights, but it was pretty hard to do it against both of them. And unfortunately, I was too eager to wipe out the enemy artillery as to prevent him from causing further harm to the rest of my team. I ended up engaging the enemy before my allies were in position to help. And now Mutant has arrived, but I have already died, and unfortunately he's been cornered from multiple angles and directions by multiple enemies.
Where'd they go?
And he ended up suffering the same fate as myself. And at this point, I believe the enemies are down to one light tank and one artillery. Mutant managed to kill one of the lights before he died. And my team has this Japanese heavy tank as well as our artillery. But even at this point, the Japanese heavy does not really inspire a lot of confidence among my team, if you will. He seems to be very incompetent and oblivious. Doesn't really know where hard cover is. Doesn't angle his armor well against probable directions from which the enemy will try to hit him from. I mean, sure, he has driven himself on cap, but he's relatively vulnerable. Rear and side armor all pointed towards the directions from which the enemy can hit him from. And he's not doing a thing about it. Seems almost dazed and confused. There he goes. The enemies managed to get him from behind, just as we thought,
down. We can only signal nearby vehicles.
and he's not really doing anything meaningful about it at all.
Ammo storage is hit. We're lucky it didn't blow.
But the enemies still have artillery in the game, and they got a light tank to do the spotting. He's just free food. Ultimately, the GW Panther, it's a pretty good performing artillery. And so right now, the hope of my team rests upon this Tier 7 British self-propelled gun, which is really not the most awe-inspiring thing in the world, unfortunately. I mean, it drives faster backward than forward, and the gun arc is narrow, and the gun is not great by any stretch of imagination, any regard. And now we wait, hoping the enemy will get to here just in position to be shotgunned. I consider the enemy have 2 last survivors. The odds are really stacked against us. Even if the enemy light tanks get shotgunned, most likely the enemy artillery would have pre-aimed, considering most of them know where the typical artillery hiding spots are, and our artillery, with its clumsiness, simply had no chance of escape and surviving. Pretty depressing, really. But you know, in a sense, you can say that kind of sums up the World of Tanks experience nowadays. And we're still waiting, unfortunately. And our artillery essentially held his fire until the enemy got really close to get the most out of his limited accuracy. But unfortunately, I believe his shot was partially absorbed by the enemy's attack, and it was ultimately a low roll splash. So the enemy light survived and killed him. So there goes my game. Last but not the least, you know, going back to the so-called title for this replay, or should I say this video, you know, different ways to be on top. You know, I essentially shows you guys, or should I say, I will show you guys how to play a T-54 Russian Tier 9 medium tank, like a madman, if you will. And I'll go as far as to say that of all the medium tanks in the game, this is probably the single tank that's most well suited for such a mindless aggression and such a suicidal insanity, if you will. So anyways, I look at the matchmaker and I realize, you know, my team is mostly made up of heavies. The enemies have more mediums. So if I had decided to go up on the north side of the map and engage enemy mediums, most likely I will not have sufficient help. Even though, you know, I'm top tier and I'm a really solid tank, things aren't looking so good up there if I had gone. So what I decided to do is to essentially exploit the perceived weakness and vulnerability the enemies will have on the heavy flank on the southwestern edge of the map, and hopefully overwhelm and annihilate the enemy detachment on this side of the map in short order before re-engaging the enemies on the other side of the map. Because ultimately, you know, it's a pretty well-known military strategy to essentially try to whittle down the enemies, utilizing, you know, a limited and localized advantage or superiority in terms of numbers, if you will. And one thing to know about T-54 is the fact that, you know, the T-54 has arguably about as much armor as a same tier heavy tank, but
Penetration.
the T-54 is simply much more agile than anything that's along the heavy tree.
They're knocked out.
And its DPM is great. For a 200 penetration, 320 alpha gun, the reload is in 6 seconds.
Penetration.
Which means, you know, if you're allowed to let loose, you can simply evaporate the enemy team. Obviously, you know, the enemy heavy is actually the most vulnerable targets there are, even though, you know, the T-54 kind of falls short in terms of penetration.
Critical hit.
You can usually out DPM the enemies, no question at all. As you can see, I just bounced the 120mm gun
Penetration.
on the enemy VKB 45. That's a bona fide tier 10 gun that's also featured on the mouse. And the E-75 and a lot of the,
Target acquired.
you know, high tier German
Enemy
tanks.
is hit.
But
Ready to fire. Target released. Permission
I think that
to
speaks
engage.
loudly about the durability of the T-54, especially consider how low profile it is and how good its firepower is and
Enemy
how
armor
mobile
is
it
hit.
is.
Critical hit. Ready
You
to
see, I
fire.
reload fast
Target
enough and the
locked.
tank is agile enough, I can consistently track and immobilize
Penetration.
the enemy Yak Tiger, and you know, I can move around fast enough that he can turn his hull.
They're knocked out.
Meanwhile, the enemy heavy could not turn himself fast enough to engage me, so he had to shoot towards me from his backside, which rendered his hull largely vulnerable,
Enemy armor is destroyed.
and I had no problem annihilating him at all. So with a single-minded rush, I essentially took out this entire side of the map, as far as the enemy team is concerned. But right now, as I expected, you know, we had overwhelming force on one side of the map, and essentially our secondary flank, which is our weaker flank, had to play a fighting retreat or had to play defense most of the game. And now the enemies have succeeded in managing to get into our base. But then, you know, by simply sitting on our base, the enemy is actually largely vulnerable, simply because we know what they're doing and we know where they are, and whether we spot them or not, we know something's there.
Enemy is hit. Penetration.
Unfortunately, the enemies managed to take cover behind a wreck of a dead tank, and I could not, you know,
Enemy armor is
get a
hit.
reliable shot into him. Meanwhile, I essentially had to reset the other enemy capper
Penetration.
to save our cap. But then that kind of gave the enemy T-54 E1 some breathing time and allowed him to rush me and reload. And considering he has an autoloader, things really aren't looking too good.
Enemy is hit.
And unfortunately at this time, my option was to either save the base and allow the enemy autoloader to rush me, or
Penetration.
to shoot the enemy autoloader but risk losing our base.
Permission to engage. Bail out. This
And
vehicle
unfortunately,
is
he managed to pin me twice and missed once, and I died. That's the rage-inducing thing about autoloaders, which is really not historically accurate at all. Consider, you know, in the real world, tanks with such oscillating turrets require their crew to expose themselves and stand on the exterior of the tank in order to reload their carousel, or should I say their ammo rack on the backside of their oscillating turret, Meanwhile, they also had a lot of trouble allowing those tanks to seal properly against biological and chemical weapons the enemies might actually deploy on the battlefield. So unfortunately, I have joked many times in game that perhaps we should introduce essentially poison gas and so on and so forth in tanks to balance out those shitty, BS, biased, unbalanced fictional tanks, if you will. But I don't think anybody cares, because ultimately I don't think a lot of people who play tanks really give a damn about history, but much rather, if anything, they preferred this form of controlled fantasy to make gameplay interesting. What can I say? People do that in their bedroom too. It is what it is. So consider I'm running Russian tanks, I just couldn't resist the urge to play their quote glorious anthem. Quite frankly, it's a pretty pleasant piece when played by piano. But anyways, as with the T-10 game, I managed to get first class in the medal, even though I barely did 1.5k worth of damage. So it goes to show that when you are supporting properly, when you are providing spots, when you are flanking properly, when you are playing the role of a proper helper, the game will reward you for what you have done. No question asked. And as with the IS-3, I managed to ace the tank with about 4k worth of damage, which is not a lot. That goes to show that perhaps the tank is relatively popular, which means, more so-so or questionable players play it, thus making, an ace tanker statistically more easy to obtain. And you can roughly say the same thing about my second replay on the IS-3. Just playing a good tank and doing my part, but in this day and age on tanks is really not enough. And last but not the least, I ended up making ridiculous profit and an ace tanker at a high caliber in the T-54 by arguably almost single-handedly shredding the enemy team, but making the ultimate sacrifice in the end, simply because my team gave insufficient support and the enemy had an autoloader. I had to multitask. I ended up the way I did. It's always a learning experience, finding out different ways to be on top. It's bittersweet, I suppose.